The third concept that I want to deal with today is the concept of time. Now we need to realize that the concept of time doesn't really exist. Time is what we would call a construct. Now it's constructed by virtue of our environment. It's only because the earth revolves around itself every 24 hours and it revolves around the sun every 365 days that we have the concept of time that we have. Because then we took those 24 hours and we divided them up and we ended up with 60 minutes. And then we took each minute and we divided them up and put it into 60 seconds. But that's how we understand time. Time has got a particular framework. Now the thing is that the time that we follow, if somebody had to ask, so how old are you? You would often respond with something like, well, I'm 25 years old. So therefore you, 25 years, it's a length of time. It's like a piece of string, which you can say this piece of string is 25 years long. And so what you end up with is what you could call linear time. Linear time. And so time for a person would maybe begin at conception or birth, depending on where you're wanting to put that, 9 months later. And then you have a certain length of time where various events will happen. And so you would say 4 years ago and 4 months ago, this particular thing happened. Or 5 months ago, that particular thing happened. And so you would end up and say that this is now. And so I've lived this long. And hopefully I've got this much left to live. And at some point, it will come to an end. That's a linear perspective of time. Now we need to understand that the linear perspective of time comes out of a very Greek way of thinking about time. It also comes out of an industrial framework whereby your understanding of time is now based in whether it is hours or minutes or seconds and based in a watch. However, you need to put yourself back in the time of the Israelites. And when you go back into the time of the Israelites, you need to realize that we're talking about a farming culture. Now, a farming culture deals with the land. It's about working the land. It's about going out and doing what the land needs to do. Now, the only time that you can work out on the land in a farming culture, and one without electricity, is when the sun comes up. And so for them, they would say, well, a day begins when the sun comes up. And a day finishes when the sun goes down. And that's the day. Sun up, sun down. And just as that cycle of the sun goes round, so what we end up with is not so much a linear time, but a cycle or a cyclical understanding of time. A cyclical understanding of time. So time begins, it goes around, and it finishes. And then, of course, tomorrow, when the sun rises again, we have the next cycle. And that cycle would be called a day. Now, the prime example of this concept of cyclical versus linear time is in the death of Jesus. It says when Jesus died, Jesus said that he would be in the tomb for 3 days, and on the third day he would rise again. Now, wait a second. Jesus died on the Friday. If we read carefully in some parts of the Gospels, we realize that's Friday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, if we were telling time in a linear fashion, that means that Saturday, 3 o'clock, would be 1 day. And Sunday, 3 o'clock, would be 2 days. Except that Jesus had already risen at sunrise on the first day, which was at 6 o'clock in the morning. Now, that means that if you're telling time in a linear fashion, Jesus was only in the tomb for a day and a half. However, if you're telling time in a cyclical fashion, then Jesus dies on Friday, and he's in the tomb on Saturday, and he rises from the grave on Sunday. 3 days. And so what we end up with is 3 days in the tomb. And so you can see it's an obvious example of the fact that they tell time differently. And so what you need to see is that this day cycle is embedded within another bigger cycle. And the biggest cycle that the day is embedded with is the length of days, is a number of days together, which we could call the seasons. Because remember, this is a agricultural society. And so in an agricultural society, how many years old you are is irrelevant. It would be, oh, I remember you. You were born in winter. And so how many winters are you now? And so you wouldn't call yourself 25 years old, but you would say, I'm 25 winters. Because that would make people connect to the particular cycle that you were in. And so what you see is that cycle of seasons is embedded into the Tanakh. That cycle of seasons is what makes up their different feasts. So they have different feasts at each of the particular seasons. So in springtime is when the lambs are being born, when things are beginning to grow and to develop. And of course, it's at that time that you have Passover. Obvious, it makes sense that you would have Passover, which is all about killing lambs, at a time when the lambs are available, which is in spring. You then have summer, which is that time of growth and of development. You then have autumn, which is the time of harvest, the time in which you then give thanks for the harvest. And so there you would have festivals like the Feast of Tabernacles. And then you would have winter. And the winter season being the season of death, the season of no growth, of no development, of no movement. And so it's in that particular season, for example, where we put Christmas. Christmas, which was in the Northern Hemisphere all about the death of things, became then a celebration of new life, the new life of Jesus Christ. And so you can see again that cycle of life is what is important, rather than this linear concept. Where this becomes most important is then the concept of eternal life. Sometimes we also call it everlasting life. The Greek word for eternal life is the word Zoe. Zoe. Sometimes we may call certain young ladies Zoe. Well, Zoe or Zoe comes from the Greek and it means eternal life. But you need to understand, therefore, that eternal life is not about how long you live. That would be a linear thinking. If, in fact, we are all in a cycle which just carries on going and moves around and around, then the concept of how long you live doesn't make sense. What does make sense is what you do in that cycle, of how you live the life of that cycle, how you live each day, how you live in each season. And so, in fact, what eternal life then becomes about is not how long you're going to live, but how well you live, the quality of life you have. And of course, for the Jews, quality of life meant how close you lived in relationship to God. Were you living in close relationship with God? Were you growing in your relationship with God? Because for them, that would be much more important in terms of time than how long you're going to live for. Time is very important to understand in the Old Testament. But always remember that, in fact, in the Old Testament or Tanakh, what we need to understand is that time is not about length. Time is about the cycle of life, from one step to another, from sun up to sundown, from sun up to sundown, through the seasons of life.